Imagine it is the dead of night. The city of Doha sleeps under a quiet sky when suddenly the roar of F-35 jets tears through the silence. Windows shatter, families leap from their beds, children scream as fireballs erupt over the capital. Israel calls it a counterterrorism strike. But to those who watched from their balconies and heard the glass rain down in the darkness, it was something far simpler: the violation of a sovereign nation. Now shift the scene thousands of miles away to the heart of Africa. In Ouagadougou, an old man rises before dawn tuning his battered radio. He hears the headline, "Qatar has been struck." His chest tightens, because for Africans, every bomb that falls in the Middle East is more than a foreign tragedy. It is a memory of villages burned, of schools flattened, of wars they never chose yet suffered. And for one young leader, silence was no longer an option. Captain Ibrahim Traoré picked up the phone and called Prime Minister Netanyahu directly. His words were calm, but they cut sharper than any missile. Africa will not stay silent. That single sentence would ripple across capitals, trigger emergency meetings, and shake Tel Aviv more than the strike itself. And here is why this story matters to you, whether you live in Chicago, Dallas, or Miami. If powerful nations can bomb Doha tonight and walk away unpunished, what stops them from dragging America's sons and daughters into another endless war tomorrow? If sovereignty means nothing for small states, can it mean anything for you? Stay with me, because in the next few minutes you will see how a little-known African president forced Israel and its backers to face something they never expected: Africa's fury, Africa's unity, and Africa's power. Please share if you feel you are among the first to support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines. At exactly 3:47 a.m. Doha time, the night sky above Qatar was ripped apart. Israeli F-35 jets thundered low, releasing precision missiles that slammed into a major communications hub at the edge of the capital. The blast lit up the skyline, shattering windows across neighborhoods and jolting families awake. Within minutes, smoke blanketed the air, and the once peaceful city was engulfed in panic. Parents clutched their children, sirens wailed, and the airwaves filled with frantic reports. Israel's official statement framed it as counter-terrorism, a preemptive strike to neutralize threats. But to anyone who witnessed the carnage, the reality was undeniable. A sovereign nation had just been attacked without warning. Across the Middle East, headlines blared. But thousands of miles away, in the heart of West Africa, the story carried an entirely different weight. In Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso's dusty capital, an old miner named Adama rose early, as he had done for decades. His battered radio crackled with static before the announcer's voice came through: "Israel has struck Qatar." He paused, his lungs heavy with dust from years in the gold pits, and whispered to his wife, "They test Qatar today. Tomorrow, they test us." For ordinary Africans like him, this was not just foreign news. It was a mirror. They remembered the decades when foreign planes had crossed their skies, when sovereignty had been treated like an afterthought, when villages and towns were reduced to rubble in wars justified as humanitarian interventions. In that moment, a ripple of recognition swept across the continent. The strike on Doha was not just about the Gulf. It was about every African city that had ever felt defenseless. And one leader knew it: Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Burkina Faso's young transitional president chose not to wait for diplomats in Washington or Paris to speak first. He picked up the phone and dialed Benjamin Netanyahu directly. His message was short, steady, and unmistakable. "Your aircraft crossed a line. Africa will not stay silent." Those words marked the true turning point. They were not shouted in anger. They were delivered calmly, as if carved into stone, and yet they set off a chain reaction more powerful than missiles. Within 6 hours, African presidents were on calls coordinating their first collective responses. Within 12 hours, Netanyahu's office was already scrambling, reaching out desperately to the African Union. And within 24 hours, the boardrooms of Tel Aviv's defense contractors were in crisis mode, calculating billions in potential losses if Africa carried through with threats of suspension. But it wasn't just governments and corporations that reacted. In the streets of Bamako, young men spray-painted slogans on concrete walls: "Africa bows to no one." In Johannesburg, pensioners phoned into late-night radio shows recalling the silence of the world during apartheid and vowing that this silence would never define Africa again. In Accra, Ghana's parliament erupted in fiery debate over whether to freeze military contracts with Israel, and in Abuja, Nigeria's president refused Netanyahu's call, outright signaling this was no longer about Burkina Faso alone. It was about Africa speaking with one voice. Television anchors across the continent spoke in urgent tones. WhatsApp groups flooded with grainy images of Doha's burning skyline. For much of the world, the attack on Qatar was another fleeting Middle Eastern headline, but for Africa, it was personal. Every explosion in Doha was an echo of their own histories of being ignored, dismissed, or trampled by stronger powers. The symbolism deepened when Traore stood before the cameras later that morning. Clad in fatigues, his eyes steady, he declared to his nation and to the world, no nation targets another nation's capital and expects African silence. That sentence reverberated through living rooms, mosques, churches, and crowded bus stations across the continent. For the first time in decades, Africa was not reacting as a bystander to someone else's war. It was preparing to shape the response. This was the seed of a larger storm. What began as a strike on a Gulf city was becoming something no one in Tel Aviv or Washington had anticipated: the awakening of Africa's fury, forged from memory, bound by dignity, and ready to confront those who assumed its silence. The hours that followed Captain Ibrahim Traoré's phone call to Benjamin Netanyahu unfolded like the ticking of a clock counting down to history. At the 6-hour mark, African leaders were already on secure lines coordinating the first joint statements. In capitals from Abuja to Accra, ministers drafted emergency communiques denouncing the strike. The words differed, but the tone was identical. This was not just about Qatar, it was about sovereignty itself. By the 12th hour, panic had gripped Tel Aviv. Netanyahu's aides scrambled to reach the African Union, a body Israel had long considered marginal in global affairs. Suddenly, that same institution became the focal point of Israel's worst diplomatic crisis in years. And by the 24th hour, defense contractors in Israel were convening emergency meetings. Contracts worth billions, surveillance systems, drone sales training programs across Africa now hung in the balance. They had underestimated the ripple effect of one calm but defiant voice from Ouagadougou. Then came the visible ruptures. Burkina Faso was the first to act, suspending military cooperation with Israel, terminating intelligence-sharing agreements, and summoning the Israeli ambassador for an urgent audience. When the ambassador insisted the bombing was a misunderstanding, Traoré's response was sharp and uncompromising. The only misunderstanding is believing Africa will remain silent when sovereignty is trampled. Other nations quickly followed. In Accra, Ghana's parliament erupted in fiery debate as opposition and ruling members alike demanded the freezing of Israeli projects. In Abuja, Nigeria's president refused Netanyahu's call outright, sending the clearest signal that Africa's biggest democracy was aligning with Traoré's stand. Across the continent, governments were not waiting for Western capitals to instruct them, they were moving on their own initiative. The streets mirrored the halls of power. In Bamako, young men painted slogans on crumbling walls, "Africa bows to no one." In Johannesburg, pensioners called late-night radio programs, their voices trembling with both memory and pride. They recalled how apartheid had endured because the world remained silent and declared that silence would no longer define Africa's place in global politics. In Nairobi, women's groups marched with banners that read, "Sovereignty is sacred." Everywhere, the same refrain echoed enough. The momentum reached its peak on the 5th day. The African Union convened an emergency summit in Addis Ababa, and delegates poured in from across the continent. Some flew overnight, others drove through treacherous roads, determined to be part of what they sensed was history in the making. Inside the Grand Marble Hall, the air was heavy with anticipation. One by one, heads of state rose to speak. They recited decades of humiliation, the names of heroes assassinated, the memories of sovereignty denied. When Traoré finally stepped to the podium, silence blanketed the chamber. He wore no expensive suit, only his military fatigues. His voice was steady, almost understated, yet it carried the weight of a generation. Africa is no longer the background of other people's wars. From this day, we are the front line of sovereignty. The applause that followed was not polite, it was thunderous, shaking the hall. And for the first time since the colonial era, the African Union voted unanimously. The decision was swift sanction: Israel suspend diplomatic privileges, cancel defense contracts, and demand accountability before the United Nations. What normally would have taken months of negotiation was resolved in hours. The symbolism was devastating for Tel Aviv. Israel had counted on divisions within Africa, on the inertia of bureaucracies, on the hesitations of leaders bound by aid and contracts. Instead, it encountered something it had never calculated: unity. Even states with quiet ties to Tel Aviv stood shoulder to shoulder, unwilling to betray the principle of sovereignty. And as if the shock of Addis Ababa were not enough, the Arab League added another twist. Emboldened by Africa's stand, they invited Traore to address their emergency session in Cairo. Cameras broadcast his words across the Middle East. Qatar stood with Africa when others looked away. Today, Africa stands with Qatar. Sovereignty is not a gift from the powerful. It is the birthright of every nation. The hall erupted in applause from Rabat to Riyadh, from Cairo to Casablanca. For Tel Aviv, this was the nightmare scenario: a young leader from a landlocked African state, now hailed as the voice of both Africa and the Arab world. What had begun as a strike on Doha had transformed into a continental and regional defiance that neither Israel nor its allies could contain. The climax was clear. Africa had found its roar, and the world, for the first time in generations, was forced to listen. The fallout was immediate and far-reaching. Within days of the African Union's unanimous sanctions, Israel's carefully built network of contracts across the continent began to unravel. Defense companies that had supplied drones, surveillance systems, and training programs to multiple African militaries saw their balance sheets collapse. Multi-billion-dollar agreements froze overnight. Mining deals in West Africa were suspended. Agricultural projects in North Africa were halted. In Tel Aviv, investors panicked, stock prices dipped, and analysts admitted on live television, "We underestimated Africa's weight." But the consequences went beyond numbers. This was about dignity. For ordinary Africans, the suspension of contracts symbolized something larger: that their governments were finally willing to put principles above profit. In Ouagadougou, students gathered outside the university, holding handwritten signs, "Qatar today, Africa tomorrow." In Lagos, taxi drivers tuned their radios to call-in shows, demanding their leaders follow Traore's example. And in Nairobi, women marched with banners declaring, "Sovereignty is sacred." The slogan spread faster than any official communiqué, igniting a sense of collective pride rarely seen in decades. Inside Burkina Faso, the shift was even more profound. Citizens who had once felt their country was too small, too poor, too landlocked to matter, now watched as their president's words reverberated across continents. Crowds gathered nightly outside the presidential palace, holding candles and chanting prayers for Traore's safety. They were not just protecting a leader, they were guarding an idea. The fear was real. Elders whispered the names of Lumumba, Sankara, and Gaddafi, all visionaries cut down when they dared to challenge global powers. But the pride outweighed the dread. For once, Africa was not begging for recognition, it was demanding respect. Politically, the unity stunned even the most seasoned observers. Countries long divided by regional rivalries suddenly found common ground. Algeria closed its airspace to Israeli flights. Morocco canceled agricultural deals. Nigeria terminated defense contracts. South Africa suspended relations outright. What had once seemed impossible, a continent speaking with one voice, was happening in real time. Diplomats in Brussels and Washington were forced to admit privately that Africa's unity had caught them off guard. For Israel, the humiliation was acute. Cameras captured its defense minister Yoav Gallant denied protocol privileges at an African airport, forced to stand at a security checkpoint like any ordinary traveler. The image went viral, a symbol of how far Israel's influence had fallen. No amount of military hardware could erase the insult of sovereignty violated. Domestically, the political ripple spread into parliaments and street debates. In Accra, lawmakers clashed over how far to push sanctions, but even the most cautious voices admitted the moral high ground was undeniable. In Abuja, Nigeria's refusal to take Netanyahu's call became a point of national pride. In Johannesburg, pensioners compared the moment to the anti-apartheid struggle, saying Africa was once again teaching the world the meaning of justice. Perhaps the most important consequence was psychological. For decades, Africa had been portrayed as a stage where stronger powers wrote the script. Now it was the writer. The strike on Doha had sparked something far larger: the realization that sovereignty could not be negotiated away, not for aid, not for contracts, not for fear. The civil and political aftermath was clear. Economically, Israel bled billions. Politically, Africa proved its unity. Socially, dignity became a rallying cry from Bamako to Cape Town. And in the collective memory of ordinary Africans, a line had been crossed, not just in the skies over Doha, but in the conscience of a continent that decided silence was no longer an option. While Africa roared, Washington and its allies scrambled. At first, American officials dismissed Captain Ibrahim Traoré's words as the reckless outburst of a small landlocked state. But within days, when 15 African leaders echoed his condemnation and the African Union voted unanimously to sanction Israel, the tone shifted from irritation to alarm. In Washington, the National Security Council convened an emergency session. Intelligence briefings warned that Africa's collective defiance threatened decades of U.S. and Israeli influence on the continent. The concern was not only diplomatic, it was strategic. Africa's resources were essential: cobalt from Congo powering electric cars, uranium from Niger fueling nuclear plants, oil and gas reserves feeding global markets. If African leaders redirected these resources away from Western corporations, the shockwaves would reach Detroit, Houston, and Silicon Valley. Suddenly, Traoré's words were no longer just about sovereignty. They were about America's own economic and security interests. American diplomats were dispatched to Abuja, Nairobi, and Pretoria with a simple message: moderation. They warned that Africa's hard line could destabilize global security. But the irony was not lost on African leaders, who destabilized the Middle East first, who invaded Iraq under false pretenses, who sponsored coups across Africa during the Cold War. Washington's calls rang hollow, carrying little moral weight. Meanwhile, the debate spilled into U.S. living rooms. On cable news, some lawmakers denounced Africa's actions as reckless, but others, particularly from states with large African-American populations, quietly praised Traoré's courage. Editorials drew parallels to Martin Luther King Jr. His words: silence in the face of injustice is complicity. Older Americans who remembered Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan asked themselves hard questions. If Africa can say no to unjust wars, why can't America? Why must our grandchildren keep fighting battles that serve no clear interest? Europe fared no better. Paris, long accustomed to pulling strings in Francophone Africa, found its calls unanswered. Brussels tried to play mediator, but discovered Africa had little interest in Europe's balancing act. London, once an empire with vast influence, could only watch as African nations spoke in a united voice that no longer sought European approval. The Middle East, on the other hand, saw opportunity. The Arab League welcomed Traoré to Cairo, elevating him to a stage no African leader had held before. Iran and Turkey praised Burkina Faso's stand, offering partnerships that promised respect rather than patronage. For Arab audiences, it was electrifying to see Africa take the lead in condemning Tel Aviv when their own governments often hesitated. In Latin America and Asia, commentators called it a turning point for the global South. From Caracas to Jakarta, leaders invoked Africa's defiance as a model for their own struggles against Western dominance. Suddenly, Africa was no longer the continent others pitied. It was the continent others emulated. At the United Nations, the shift was unmistakable. When African ambassadors took the floor to condemn Israel's strike on Qatar, the chamber was packed. Cameras stayed fixed, journalists scribbled furiously. Normally, African interventions were half-empty, treated as formalities. Now, they were headline events. For Israel, the global picture was bleak. Its narrative of self-defense faltered as Africa's united voice reframed the strike as a violation of sovereignty. For Washington, the nightmare deepened. What if Africa's defiance spread? What if Latin America or Asia took similar stances against Western influence? The possibility alone was enough to unsettle policymakers. The global lens was clear. To Africa, this was about sovereignty. To Israel, it was a strategic humiliation. To Washington and Europe, it was a warning shot that power was shifting. And to ordinary people in Chicago, Dallas, or Miami, it posed a haunting question: if Africa can resist being dragged into wars of impunity, why can't we? As the smoke cleared above Doha, the echoes of that night carried far beyond the Gulf. Across Africa, the strike was not remembered as Israel's show of force, but as Africa's awakening. For the first time in a generation, 54 nations had spoken with one voice. And that voice did not come from Washington, Paris, or Brussels. It came from Ouagadougou, a capital the West once dismissed as irrelevant. The symbolism could not be ignored. For decades, Africa had been treated as a backdrop, a stage on which foreign powers played their wars. Yet in 1 week, the script flipped. Africa was no longer the audience, it was the actor, the protagonist, the one setting terms. Ibrahim Traoré did not invent Africa's hunger for dignity, but in one decisive moment he embodied it. He reminded the world of Lumumba's courage, Sankara's vision, and Gaddafi's defiance. And he reminded Africans themselves that every generation produces leaders willing to risk everything for sovereignty. But the story is not over. The real test is not whether Africa can roar for a week, but whether it can endure the storms that follow. Sanctions from Washington, pressure from Europe, intelligence plots from Tel Aviv, these will come. History warns us that unity is fragile and betrayal often comes from within as much as from outside. Will Africa's leaders resist the temptations of aid and contracts dangled before them? Or will today's courage dissolve under tomorrow's pressure? For ordinary families, the question is deeply personal. In Ouagadougou, the old miner Adama told his grandson, "When I was your age, we whispered the names of Lumumba and Sankara. Today, you shout the name of Traoré. Do not let it slip away." His words capture the essence of this moment: hope balanced by fear, pride shadowed by risk. Yet above all, the belief that dignity is worth defending. And for you watching from Chicago, Dallas, Miami, or anywhere in the world, the lesson is just as urgent. If a small landlocked African nation can demand respect without tanks or drones, what excuse do the most powerful democracies have? If Africa can say no to impunity, why can't we? Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. And comment below, do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's strategies for national reform are truly effective, or should Africa prepare for another leader to carry the torch? Because today Africa said enough, and tomorrow that same voice may defend sovereignty wherever it is threatened.